With over 20 years' experience in education, she has taught in mainstream schools, SEN provision, and worked for over 10 years as a specialist mental health advisor teacher for a local authority. She is the founder of the Hypnotherapy in Schools program, which uses hypnotherapy in schools to help pupils and staff increase their well-being, thereby improving outcomes and helping to raise attainment. Caroline is also director of Managing Minds, a company that provides mental health advice, therapy and training to educational settings in the Midlands. She is a clinical supervisor for hypnotherapists and has written numerous articles and is regularly a conference speaker. Her talk is titled, Working with Children During the Pandemic. The talk will explore the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on supporting children and young people with their mental health and well-being. It will look at issues that have arisen as a result of lockdown, how youngsters have reacted to the pandemic, some of the positives that have come out of it, and the implications for supporting the mental health and well-being of children and young people in the future. Again, if you have any questions for the speaker, please type them into the Zoom chat area. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction. Right, let me just share my screen. Okay, I'll hope everybody can hear me. Tom, would you just give me a nod, let me know that you can hear me okay? Yep, thumbs up, that'll do. Great, thank you. First of all, delighted to be here. It's been really interesting listening to all the other presentations, and I particularly like the fact that obviously this is a multicultural one, and the different perspectives has been really interesting to listen to also. So I'm going to focus on the children's side of things. There's obviously been a lot of talk about the pandemic affecting the professionals, obviously the adults, the people in hospitals, and a lot of adults, but all the effect that that has on the adults obviously has a knock-on effect on the children and young people as well. So my role is working predominantly in schools. So I have been in private practice, but at the moment I'm full-time in schools. So I work in lots of different schools, special schools, mainstream primary, mainstream secondary schools. And through this pandemic, it was really interesting because, as everybody says, the good old catch-all, it was unprecedented. Schools closing was definitely something that I'd never experienced apart from the odd snow day. So I'm going to talk through a bit about how that came across, how I managed that, and how the young people dealt with that as well. So the pandemic really, from a school perspective, there were two lockdowns in terms of schools. I know the actual lockdowns in terms of society was slightly different. And it's been very interesting, the difference with how the children have responded between the two different lockdowns. So the first one was obviously very abrupt, very unplanned. Schools didn't really know what they were doing. The teachers didn't know what they were doing. So part of my role is also supporting the adults. I know the talks around children, but obviously supporting the staff to be able to support the students. The first lockdown, there were very infrequent virtual lessons. Schools were getting their heads around everything. There was definitely a novelty factor that, again, the children and the young people I was working with, certainly when I was doing my calls in the first lockdown. So if I just explain a bit, the first sort of roughly 5 or 6 weeks of that very first lockdown on the 23rd of March, certainly in the UK, 2020, I was then remote. So I was working from home, trying to do all my therapeutic support that I do with students remotely. And I'll talk about some of the issues with that and the positives with it. After that, then, certainly in the UK, it started to change. So key worker children, so frontline healthcare workers, people who worked in supermarkets, some of those key worker children were allowed into school, and highly vulnerable students were allowed in. So children who were looked after, children who were in care, really specific, they had to be at quite a high level. Some of those students I was working with. So the first 5 weeks, it was me, 5, 6 weeks, trying to get used to working remotely. Then I started to be allowed back in, classed as a key worker. And then it was trying to do those sessions with all of the social distancing, with all of the safety things in place, and then managing both. The second lockdown, which was the 1st of January from this year, was actually perceived quite differently by the young people. And again, I want to kind of try and give the young person's perspective. So by this point, the novelty had definitely worn off. There was more concern about their education. But schools, on the flip side of that, schools were much more organised, there was more structure, the timetabled lessons were in, all of which impacts mental health. And they were more open and accessible. So instead of it just being highly vulnerable students, it was expanded actually to anyone that was perceived as vulnerable. So that included just any young person who might be experiencing anxiety. Whereas the first lockdown, they'd have had to have had a diagnosis of something really to have got in. So there was quite a big difference between the two lockdowns. Issues that arose, certainly in the first 5 or 6 weeks when I was working remotely, it was trying to access those students at home. Predominantly I work with teenagers. I do work with primary as well. So some of the primary students I was working with, it actually was impossible to access them at home. Home lives being very turbulent, very difficult. Actually, that therapy had to go on hold, which had a really big impact, both on the therapeutic relationship and all the work that myself and the student or my client had been doing. But with the teenagers that I could access, it was very noticeable that they didn't want video calls. They were very self-conscious. I did very few of them. So all my clients were offered either a phone consultation or phone sessions or over video. Very, very few of the teenagers chose the video. Those that did, it was them working out where we position it, because the only bit of privacy in a lot of homes for the young people is actually their bedroom. So then you open up all those difficulties of working with somebody in their bedroom and going into their space. Some of them wanted phone calls out of the two options. And it certainly stuck out to me how young people nowadays don't actually speak on the phone very often. It's all social media, it's texting. And actually some of them, it was really difficult trying to get them to open up about feelings and get into some of those conversations over the telephone. Some of the other issues that arose through students being off and not in school is the massive one that came through was the removal of peer support, and how helpful, obviously at that brain stage in the early teenage years, the peer support is so fundamental, and a lot of that had disappeared. So, and again, I'll come on this onto this in the positives, but that was initially removed. So some of the students I work with are what we call in the UK pupil premium students. So they're on a lower income. So some of those students didn't have phones, didn't have the internet, didn't have the ability to actually keep in touch with friends. That had a huge impact on some of the youngsters I worked with in terms of their mental health. There was an increase in domestic abuse. So occasionally when I'd phone up, I'd actually call up in the middle of something really difficult going on. All the things that other presenters have talked about, all those other triggers of stress and financial pressures on the adults, does have that knock-on effect to the students and the kids that I'm working with. The time of call with teenagers was challenging. None of them wanted to be called before midday because they were all having lie-ins. So certainly the first lockdown, when there wasn't the structure from schools in terms of the lessons, it was quite difficult to fit all my calls in, because I would normally see a student at 9 o'clock in the morning at school, and I was regularly phoning and finding kids were still in bed, sleep had gone out the window. So actually timing the calls was really quite a challenge with the teenagers. And trying to get them to see the importance of therapy, especially during that really difficult time at the beginning. So I ended up having to shift a lot of them starting late morning and going through a bit into the early evening, because I needed to touch base with those people, and I really wanted to keep that therapy going. In the second lockdown, when the virtual lessons became a bit more structured, there was then a conflict with those lessons. So I might ring when they're in the middle of a virtual maths lesson. So that then caused a few issues, trying to time those sessions. Then when that, certainly the first lockdown ended, there were then quite a few attachment issues that I saw of young people that had got really close to parents. So it's quite unusual that a lot of parents would be working from home while the children are off school, and actually those bonds get really strong. And for some of the vulnerable youngsters, they got used to having mum and dad at home, they got used to being at home. So actually, when they then had to go back to school, I had to do quite a lot of work in school, supporting young people returning back who really struggle to leave the parents or the adult caregivers in the home. That's then kind of compounded if they've been poorly, if they've got long COVID and they're not very well, if there's then been losses and grief involved, that then again, some of the young people are very wary of leaving the house because they're worried what will happen from a health point of view. The confidentiality is difficult when you're on the phone. So again, for young people, they can't get the same level of confidentiality. So an adult, listening to Michelle earlier, she obviously got her confidentiality by going and sitting in the back of a car on a hill. Obviously, young people can't do that. They couldn't leave the house really. So then it was difficult trying to make sure that they weren't overheard. Little siblings running in and out of the room while they're in the middle of a session. And also another kind of new one that was difficult was when you ring, because of the way the schools work, I had to ring on the parent's mobile or home line, which meant then I ended up in a conversation with the parent. That's not necessarily a problem. Certainly when I work privately, I'd work quite in hand with the parents. But that's not the way it normally works in schools. So some of the youngsters were quite cautious about the fact I'd have a bit of a chit chat with mum or dad first before I then spoke to them. And that added a whole other dynamic, and having to clarify that the confidentiality won't be broken, that I'm just, having a chat with mum and dad, but we're not talking about you, we're not talking about the session. In terms of hypnotherapy, it was difficult to do any kind of hypnosis remotely, really. So it was stripping out the bits of it, doing a progressive relaxation, doing breathing exercises. It ended up being an awful lot in that kind of 5-6 weeks where I was remote, tailor making MP3s and recordings and sending them through for young people to listen to. None of them wanted it via a video kind of meeting like this. I wasn't comfortable doing it just over the phone. I like to see the person when I'm working with them when they're going into trance. So there was an awful lot of me recording MP3s, emailing those over, talking through it, having the chat, then letting them go off and listen to them during that week. And then the phone call was kind of checking in with that. So a little bit of that, doing MP3s, is what I would normally have done. But it was working in a different way, really. The key worker provision was this provision that school offered for, the frontline healthcare workers and some of the others that were classed as key workers. This had two effects, really. It could be really positive. So youngsters were saying, I get more one-to-one input, it's more relaxed. One of the schools I was in were doing more creative life skills lessons. And actually, for those that were in, the vast majority absolutely loved this smaller setting. And some of them really thrived in it. They got to know the staff on a whole different level. It was less noisy for those on the autistic spectrum. It was less noisy, it was less busy. It was actually a much nicer environment for them. There was a bit of a group identity when the rest of the school returned, which was interesting to see. Of those that have been at, so certainly one of the schools I worked in called it small school, which was this key worker provision. And it was like the small school gang. And when the rest of the school came back, there was an anxiety about, I don't want the rest of the school back. I've liked it like this. Getting quite almost possessive and attached to some of the teachers they'd made those good relationships with. So again, pros and cons with that kind of provision. The impact, generally very mixed. Again, as other people have commented on, we were all going through it at the same time, so there was no previous experience to draw upon. So instead of parents being very comfortable and being able to offer reassurance, there was very little of that, because I was actually doing bits of therapy with the parents sometimes when they were picking up the phone. The use of technology was good, as in it allowed some of those young people to keep in touch. Obviously, it allowed me to access some of those people when they weren't in school. The flip side of that being a lot of kids were on it an excessive amount in terms of gaming consoles, etc. And actually some of the social skills I've noticed have dropped a little, because the young people have been used to being quite cooped up and not really going out. I've definitely noticed an increase in mental health issues like OCD, quite a few eating disorders. You'd expect things like the anxiety and the attachment. And actually, certainly since the second lockdown's lifted in the past few months, just as the last speaker was saying, a huge amount more of suicidal ideation, and really sadly lots of attempts with it. I've never had so many young people who are suicidal on my caseload. So I think the impact has been quite delayed. The first bit was quite a novelty. I think the second time round, it's definitely having an impact much, much later from what I'm seeing in schools. The positives, however, the technology, as I mentioned, did allow some social support. Those that were anxious actually really benefited from having a bit of a break. But then the downside to that is it was difficult to come back. Those who'd got exam anxiety obviously didn't have the exams, so you could say they benefited. The flip side of that, again, being they haven't actually faced that anxiety. So will that just roll over to A levels or when they go to university? I talked through the key worker school benefits, the appreciation of social contact and routine. There were quite a few children I saw that used to hate school, and actually since this have said, you know what, I've started to realise school's not that bad and what it does do for me, you know, and how much the teachers do care. So for some that were quite disengaged from education, it's actually been really helpful. I've also been brought in on a more systemic level. So hypnotherapy has gone up the radar, as in, oh, this is something that's really helpful and useful. I've been doing more bits of training for parents, so it's been much more a community-based thing. So parents, school staff, children, doing assemblies. It's opened up more than just one-to-one, and it's got schools thinking about how we can use mental health support in a slightly different way, both therapy, but also some of the skills around it. And just finally, the future really. Again, it's been echoed today that virtual therapy has become a lot more accepted, a lot more accessible, a lot more mainstream. You know, seeing what Peter was presenting earlier about the therapy hub, I've forgotten the name of it, but, you know, all that sort of stuff I think is a real positive. There's a huge demand for it. I've certainly got 3 new schools next week that want to talk to me about buying in an extra support. You know, I'm full-time, I can't take on anymore, but certainly people are talking more about it and wanting to get that support in. We've obviously got a blueprint for a pandemic now. Hopefully we won't need it again in the future. The long-term effects on children in terms of development, you know, I've put the question marks there because I think it'll be very interesting, if that's the right word. Certainly toddlers who haven't experienced a kind of mainstream environment really. Youngsters, certainly I've got friends with little ones that aren't used to going to childcare with other people, and what impact that's going to have, I think, for the really little children. I think there'll be a lot to see in the future what comes out of this, because certainly there's a delay already. But I think they're going to need professionals like all of us and therapists now more than ever. And hopefully I've not gone over my time. Let me just try and stop sharing the screen.
Thank you, Caroline. I think That's, it's really a good insight into working with children. And I can see the challenges that you've had as well. We're still having the challenges here. Okay. One of some of the questions are basically related to the dynamics between the children and the parents as well. So there's one question about how is the parental presence, one regarding that, and the dynamics between the.
Okay, so sorry, so is it about the parental presence when I was phoned?
Yeah, the parental presence. I mean, are they present during the therapy or?
No, they're not present in schools, and obviously and that was the difficulty. So when it moved remote, the parents were in the house. So part of the school's criteria, if I'm working remotely, there is an adult in the house. They don't have to be in the same room. They're deliberately to leave the room, but the schools all wanted an adult present from a safeguarding point of view, I think. So no, in schools they're not present, but certainly remotely they were around, which did change the dynamic a little. So the parents wanted to listen in because it was actually a chance to find out what went on. And it was actually me talking to the parents and saying, in the nicest possible way, you need to give them that confidentiality.
Exactly.
And that,
is there any minimum age of a child that you work with? Because it may be different, because you may be working with younger children when you're at schools. So is there a minimum age when you work with the child virtually?
Yes, so my primary age students, as I briefly mentioned, a lot of the primary age, which if you're not aware in Malaysia or Singapore, goes up to 11, so it's kind of 5 to 11. A lot of those did end up going on a pause because they just couldn't access the phone in the same way. So a lot of those paused, and what it ended up becoming was me sometimes working with the parents around strategy to help them. Or again, sending over the MP3 so they could listen to it. But yeah, it was more the teenagers were remote and the primary. Some of the kind of 10, 11-year-olds managed it, but generally the primary ones ended up having to pause for a bit.
Okay, I've got a question here from Kathleen, who's a clinical hypnotherapist as well. She's been involved in the local authority and charity sector. So she wants to know how you can approach schools initially to promote hypnotherapy.
You could approach them in any way. I mean, the Hypnotherapy in Schools program has a course that does that, but I don't want to get into kind of promoting my stuff on here. But you're welcome to look at the website and find out a bit more. And there's strategies on that course about kind of approaching schools. But I would just encourage anybody to go and speak to a school and explain what you offer. Part of HISP is about trying to demystify hypnotherapy so that it becomes as mainstream as counselling, because hypnotherapy still has some of the misconceptions, and I'm certainly on a mission to try and get rid of those. It's just another therapy. It's not witchcraft or anything else, or Paul McKenna or anything else you see.
Okay, maybe I'll take a last question. Did you need to change anything or add anything since the therapy is now online? So as compared to your regular therapy, did you have to add on anything?
All the usual kind of safeguards, a bit like Michelle was saying at the beginning, all the safeguards about if you wake up in the middle of it, if you're distracted at any point. Obviously, you can't see what they're doing, so you've just got to be more general, really. The MP3s I make are tailor-made, but the kind of waking script and the deepener and stuff tends to be more standardized. But it was just thinking about when you're going through that, okay, I can't see them, they're listening to it on a track, what things might come up, they might be disturbed, they might not feel great when they're doing it, just those sorts of things.
Thank you so much for your sharing, Caroline. I think you've answered a lot of the queries. If we didn't manage to get to all of the questions, we will definitely get back to the participants. We'll be communicating with the speakers to get back their responses. Thank you so much, Caroline.
You're welcome.